Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar on carbon accounting. For those who don't know me, I'm Zoe. I've been with Godfrey Laws for 18 years, starting as an accountant and moving into audit, and I'm now leading our carbon accounting service. We're delighted to be joined by Kat from Trace today. Kat is the co-founder of Trace, a company founded with the mission to help businesses move towards net zero. They do this by helping to measure carbon emissions and create carbon reduction plans. Godfrey Laws has partnered with Trace to help you understand why measuring your carbon emissions is important, both now and for the future. Kat will now take you through the background of carbon accounting, how to prepare for it, and how Godfrey Laws can support you. Kat, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zoe. I'm just going to share some slides to help guide us through this session. So please, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Excellent. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me, Zoe and Godfrey Laws. Absolute pleasure to have been partnered with you to help your clients reach net zero. By way of introduction, my name is Kat. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Trace. We launched in 2020 with a simple mission to help companies of all shapes and sizes reach net zero. And today I want to talk you through what the real basics and the 101 of what carbon is, why this matters, and how to get started on your journey. Now, the key difference with our software platform is that we partner with accountants like Godfrey Laws to help companies measure and reduce their carbon emissions. So it's designed to be used by you, the SME, but also by your accountant who know your data and your business as well as you do. So what are we going to cover today? First, I want to go through a real basic 101. So what are carbon emissions? Why do they matter? And what does net zero really mean? I know there's a lot of jargon in this space, so I want to debunk some of the myths and the kind of noise that you hear in all of the terminology. Then I'm going to help you understand what's driving the demand for carbon accounting. Why do you as a business need to measure your emissions today, and what's the benefit of doing so? And then finally, how businesses can prepare their carbon reports and how you might work with Godfrey Laws to do so. So whether you're just starting your sustainability journey today or already on your way, hopefully you'll come away with some really clear insights and next steps. So let's jump into the absolute basics. So apologies if anyone here listening is a bit of a guru and knows all of this terminology, but I always like to go back to the real basics because it often gets forgotten when we're really deep in the weeds of the data. You might have seen this beautiful image that's often on LinkedIn. It looks like a nice wallpaper. It's actually a lot more impactful than that. This represents the global average temperature rise since the Industrial Revolution. So each stripe represents the average temperature for a single year from 1961 onwards. So obviously the deeper red, the hotter the year. And since that Industrial Revolution, we've actually seen over 1.2 degrees in warming. Now, that might not seem like much, but we're already seeing a huge increase, and you've probably all suffered firsthand from extreme weather, and that is why this is so important. And you can see towards the right-hand side, the warming accelerating at a serious pace. So the gateway to understanding why carbon is driving climate change and why it means that we're having these temperature changes is by understanding what carbon does. So if you think about carbon dioxide, it's a greenhouse gas that essentially acts as a blanket over the earth. The levels of carbon dioxide have been rapidly increasing since the Industrial Revolution and our use of fossil fuels. And that essentially acts to keep the sun's heat within the planet. And this can have really dire consequences for nature and all the people and companies that operate within it. So that's really why we focus on carbon dioxide, because by measuring it, we can start to manage it and hopefully reduce the emissions that we as individuals and businesses create so that we can work towards net zero. Now, scientists believe that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels to reduce the odds of basically irreversible climate change. Unfortunately, latest sort of research suggests that we're already on track to exceed that, which really calls to why this is so important to act today and for every company to see net zero as a goal that we need to achieve ASAP. Now, in 2015, you might have heard of the Paris Agreement, which was agreed as a binding international agreement that states that both state and non-state actors would commit to net zero by 2050 in order to prevent this catastrophic global warming. but the reality is this needs to happen a lot sooner. So what we've seen since the Paris Agreement is that many countries around the world, at slightly different paces, are enacting some sort of legislation to try and enforce net zero within their government and also within the private sector. I'm not going to go through every single country and every single legislative framework here, but to call out a few, New Zealand has been one of the first to act. Australia, which I'll talk about later, has actually already enforced climate disclosures in order to help companies stay on top of their climate-related risks and opportunities. And then I'll talk a little bit about the UK, which is currently under consultation and likely to enforce some level of reporting over the next few years. Now, climate action in the UK, or the Climate Change Act, commits the UK by law to reaching net zero by 2050, and it has actually set legally binding carbon budgets. So at the very top of our country, we have the government actually legally obliged to achieve net zero. And that's really important because it means that the government is now rolling out frameworks, policy and guidelines to help us get there, because they can't do it alone. But let's just rewind a second, because I use the term net zero and not everybody understands what that means. It's often misused because it's a little bit of a confusing term. So setting a target is one thing, but actually achieving net zero is another. What do we mean? It essentially says, look at your baseline emissions today. How much carbon dioxide is your company or country emitting? That's your baseline. And the goal of net zero is to reduce those emissions by 90% by whatever date that you set. So it's a really ambitious target. If you think about what's driving emissions today, it's typically transport, it's energy consumption, and then it's all of the goods and services that we use that also use transport and energy. So to get a 90% reduction requires a huge collaborative effort across both the public and private sector. Now, you might have heard people talk about carbon offsets or carbon credits. Those can be used during the transition in order to offset any emissions that are hard to avoid right now. However, they are not considered a tool to reach net zero. We need to genuinely and formally eliminate carbon dioxide in order to reach net zero. So, how do we actually get there? There's a few different kind of approaches you can take, but we've broken it down into pretty simple steps. For you as a company, number one, understand where you are today. You wouldn't go on a diet without measuring yourself today. You wouldn't set a budget for your own household without knowing what you spend today. So it's really important to know where we're starting from, and that's called your baseline. Then you set targets from there, and that might be net zero by X. It might be moving to renewable energy by 2030. It could just be continuously measuring your baseline and tracking it. All of these targets are good and show a commitment to action. It's really crucial and important to commit and share that, whether that's internally or externally. It creates a level of accountability, which I think is really important to help companies actually make that progress. And as we've seen with the governments, they have set legally binding targets for themselves, and obviously that is publicly known. So therefore, governments are held to account to achieve that. Now, after committing and sharing your targets, you obviously have to start acting. So building a plan for decarbonisation, and then over time starting to look to implement initiatives like changing how you travel, moving to renewable energy, reducing waste. There's lots of different things you can do, and some have immediate impact, some will take longer. You can then report that over time to show your progress, and then anything that you can't reduce in the interim, you can mitigate through things like carbon offsets. So that's a continuous cycle that happens sort of every year, and Trace, in partnership with Godfrey Laws, can help you as a business do that. Now, what are emissions and where do they come from? You've probably heard the terms scope 1, 2, and 3. So just quickly to help you understand what that means. Scope 1 are your direct emissions. They come from activities that are directly under your company's control. So broadly, this means any combustion of fuel. So that could be petrol or diesel that you're using in your fleet. It could be a leakage from your air conditioning units, or it could be what we call stationary fuel for things like generators. So you're buying that fuel and burning that fuel on site or within your control. Scope 2 is called your indirect emissions from electricity purchased. So this is where you're not generating your own electricity, you're buying it from an electricity provider, and therefore you are assuming the emissions generated from that electricity production, which a lot of the time these days is moving on to renewable energy, but still we have a huge reliance on coal, and that is obviously creating carbon dioxide. Now, the biggest and most complex is scope 3, and that's really everything else that sits within your value chain or supply chain. So any activities upstream, like transport and distribution to get your goods to your distribution centers. It could be your employees commuting. It could be the purchased goods and services that you use every day, from subscriptions to data centers. It's your flights. And then downstream, it's anything that happens as a result of your products and services. So this is harder to control, but possible to influence, and a really important factor when you come into carbon accounting, because without reducing scope 3, we really have no hope of getting to net zero, given it typically makes up 70 to 90% of a company's emissions. So hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of why net zero is so important, how it's been legislated at the kind of public policy level, and how we categorize emissions so that you can start thinking about a reduction plan for your own business. But now let's talk about why it's so important for businesses like yourselves to manage its carbon emissions and provide that data publicly. Essentially, climate action is no longer a choice. We see it as a business imperative. A recent survey showed that nearly half of UK companies have already been asked to report their carbon emissions, and even within the SME set of this research, the number was over a third. So it's really, really common these days for companies to be asked to provide carbon data to stakeholders. And soon we believe the next step of that will be the requirement for a decarbonisation plan, and we're already seeing that in practice. So I'll come on to that in a minute. There are three powerful forces that's driving this demand. First, regulation that's being rolled out by governments around the world, requiring certain businesses to report their emissions. It typically affects larger companies, but in some jurisdictions, we're actually seeing it affect SMBs as well. The second effect or demand driver is the supply chain. So pressure from companies who you supply to and their requirement to get to net zero, and as a result, affecting their supply chain by implication. And last but not least, and one that's been sort of bubbling away for quite some time now, is consumers and employees that are choosing brands and employers and companies based on their own values of sustainability. So this is where you can really get a competitive advantage by showing that you have a carbon strategy and a climate plan. This diagram shows a bit more detailed about how those demands interplay. So at the very top, you have a binding legal commitment from a country that might say net zero by 2050, just like the UK. As a result of that commitment, governments are forced to legislate. So they tend to bring in regulation, normally affects the largest companies, as I mentioned, and that can then affect policy at the government level as well. And I'll give you an example of this that's affecting the NHS supply chain. The policy might then affect corporates, big companies, multinationals that are then required to set their own targets. And that then has a knock-on impact on their supply chain. And the result of all of that is SME reporting at scale. So if 33% of SMBs have already been asked for carbon emissions and carbon reporting, we will see that number go up and up as the knock-on impacts come down from the governments. Now, Australia is a really good example. I want to just share this quickly because it shows that their recent legislation that came into force from 1st of January 2025 actually affects relatively small companies. So by 2027, any company with more than 100 employees and 50 million in revenues, now that's Aussie dollars, so let's call that 25 million pounds, has to report, and they have to disclose not only their carbon emissions, but their climate related risks and opportunities and their strategy to mitigate that. These are not big firms. These are mid-market or even in some case SMB firms that now are required by law to provide carbon data publicly. So we're expecting the UK to follow suit pretty soon. Let's dig into some examples of these supply chain impacts because it's most likely to affect your company, assuming that you supply to either government or businesses. There are really two drivers of this supply chain pressure. One is public policy and the other is corporate targets. So let's just dive into an example of each. The best example I can give you of public policy is what we call the Procurement Policy Note 0621. So PPN 0621, a little bit of a mouthful there. But this is a policy that was introduced very recently across government public organisations in order to ensure that those public services can reach net zero. So an example of this is actually the NHS. From 2024, the NHS has mandated that every single company that supplies to them, so anything from a coffee supplier in one of their cafes to their largest medical device companies to a big pharmaceutical brand, must be able to show that they have a decarbonisation plan, and they call that a CRP. Here are the requirements in a bit more detail. So this is their net zero supplier roadmap. You can see here that from 2024, they have to have a carbon reduction plan. This is for all contracts above 5 million per annum, but that floor actually drops from 2027. So we at Trace are working with hundreds of companies that this is affecting to help them not only measure their emissions, but build a plan to decarbonize. And if that affects any of you, it's really worth having a discussion with Godfrey Laws today. Inside the CRP or carbon reduction plan, there are 7 key requirements. So it requires you to have a target, to set your baseline, to report your carbon dioxide across scopes 1, 2, and 3. And then you need to be able to show that you've got measures in place to reduce that and governance as well to continuously improve. So you can actually go online and see an example of some CRPs, and we've written many for our customers. Although it doesn't have to be a huge laborious document, a lot of work has to go into the preparation of that in order for you just to be able to secure or retain your contract with the NHS. So it affects the NHS so far, but we're expecting it to be rolled out across defence and education and many other public organisations shortly. Here's a quote from the head of sustainability in the NHS. As you can see, he very clearly states that it is mandatory that every tender includes a carbon reduction plan. So this is no longer just a nice to have, it is imperative. What about for companies that supply to large corporates or the public sector or even publicly listed companies? That is an increasing demand driver as well. So many regulations affect these corporates, and as a result, these corporates have set net zero targets, which includes scope 3. If you remember, scope 3 is your value chain or your supply chain. So if you need to get to net zero as a corporate, the only way to get there is to require your suppliers to also reach net zero. So in order to truly understand the impact of their scope 3 emissions, they need to start demanding data from their supply chain. That might be you if you supply to any of these businesses. Let's have a look at some of the examples. This is just some of the big logos that we have seen publicly require supply chain reporting. I know the BBC has requirements as well. Increasingly, we're seeing companies come out with these expectations. So have a look on the website of your largest clients and see if part of their procurement expectations is carbon reporting. Let's have a quick look at a case study. This is what we've seen from Amazon. So they've got a supply chain disclosure requirement, and this allows them to ask any supplier at any time for credible greenhouse gas targets and to share their progress by reporting and providing their emissions data. So imagine Amazon is one of your biggest clients, and then all of a sudden they come to you and say, we need your emissions data. If you haven't got that ready, it's going to be a very big scramble to try and understand what your footprint is. So we really hope that you will get on top of this and have a competitive advantage by having this data ready. So beyond this requirement, there are actually some real upsides, not just mandatory requirements, but some real upsides to you measuring and managing your carbon emissions. Firstly, generally carbon reduction translates into cost reduction. Measuring your emissions might cost a little bit of money to start with. You may need some external support or a software provider, but over time you will see opportunities to reduce those emissions, which may come from procuring renewable energy, which can save you money over time, or reducing your spend on travel, which will definitely save you money over time. So it's a really important connection between climate and finances here. The second is that sort of value chain, values driver piece. So 81% of consumers prefer to buy from businesses that are sustainable. So you can actually use sustainability as a competitive advantage to drive loyalty within your business. We particularly see this with consumer brands. You know, some of the really famous brands like Patagonia are very strong on their climate commitments. And this drives, I'd say this is a real part of their USP and why so many consumers, repeat purchase from them. Likewise for your employees, younger generations in particular care drastically about climate change. They can see its effects. They always have since they've been born, and they're nervous. They are worried about their future. So we have seen from lots of research that staff expect their employers to take action and in fact tend to choose companies based on their commitment to climate resilience. Last but not least, we've seen obviously the opportunity to win business. So the ability to win and retain those large tenders, be they corporates or public companies. It's a really important factor for them and something that could be requested any day. So you want to get ahead of that. So thankfully, we're moving to a world where every business needs to take accountability for its impact on the planet. And this is showing up every day in tenders, applications, and investor and customer requirements. So ensuring you have high trust, high quality carbon data, and even better, a carbon reduction plan is an incredibly important opportunity for your business. So the great thing is you're not alone in this. You have software providers like Trace and amazing advisors like Godfrey Laws. If I could share just one sort of takeaway, we are moving to a world where every business is expected to account for its impact on the planet. That could be you. Just because you might think you're a low emissions company, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't start thinking about this. SMEs are a huge contributor to carbon emissions because of their sheer volume. So even though on your own you may not feel like you have a massive contribution to climate change, all added up, it's really important that SMEs start jumping on the net zero bandwagon. We really hope that you will take away from today thinking, I want to get ahead of this. I want to set this as my competitive advantage. And I urge you to speak to Godfrey Laws on how they can help you do that. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Zoe, who I think might see if there's any questions. And I'm obviously very happy to answer any from the audience.
Thanks, Kat. As Kat mentioned, carbon accounting is starting to affect all the SMEs, and soon it's going to become a requirement for everybody to report in their accounts. As your accountants, we're best placed to help you through this process. The carbon accounting report starts by analysing your accounting data to calculate your current carbon emissions. From this, we can help you identify areas that need attention and help you reduce your emissions. If you use cloud accounting software, we can access your data directly for more streamlined analysis. Scope 1 and 2 emissions can be measured directly from your accounts data. Every entry in your accounts has a direct carbon value. As your accountants, your point of contact at Godfrey Laws already understands your accounts, which will make this process seamless. Scope 3 emissions require additional information. To capture these, we'll send you and your employees a short questionnaire about commuting, equipment use, and any remote working opportunities. Responses will be confidential and will only be used for preparing your carbon accounts. Once all the data is reviewed, you'll receive a carbon accounting report. This report can be used when tendering and will soon need to be disclosed in your accounts. We're excited to announce that Godfrey Laws is launching our carbon accounting service in the new year to help our clients gain the competitive advantage by adopting carbon accounting before it becomes mandatory. I'd like to thank Kat for her insights today and thank you all for attending. Further details of our service will follow in an email to all of our attendees. Thank you and have a lovely day.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.